according to Monsieur Jean Philpot, what happened in Syria and why did it happen?
Well, let's go back a bit. I view Syria as a progressive country, a sovereign country, which should be sovereign, which stood up for Palestine. The Americans genuinely wanted to destroy Syria because Syria was a sovereign country in their way. Since when does the West believe in human rights? Since when does the U.S. and Canada believe in human rights when they finance and they send arms to Israel? That Syria had free education, women's rights were respected. It was not sectarian in terms of religion. People in Syria, people were thrown in jail, especially after 2011, because they were taking up arms against a legitimate government.
You're not going to be put in prison just because you insult the president.
I don't think that this type of argument justifies the overthrow of the Syrian government. That is the reason, one of the reasons why there's repression, all right?
So you agree there's repression?
Oh my God. Well, repression is not always wrong.
Why not?
Sometimes it's necessary.
When discussing Syria, you said a phrase that intrigued me. You said, "Je ne peux pas écrire une lettre au devoir, elle ne sera pas publiée." In English, I cannot write a letter in La Devoir, it will not be published. Can you tell me why you couldn't write a letter in Le Devoir about Syria?
There's two reasons. One, I'm not a professor who's an expert in Syrian history, unlike Samir Saul, who might be. But if I was a professor of history, or I'm a lawyer and I'm pretty informed, we go against the grain, and Le Devoir has become more and more conservative over the last 2 or 3 years and less open to publicly publishing articles which go against the common thinking, the general principles of Canadian law, Canadian political parties. So that's the situation right now. And so the mainstream media don't publish much. And this, if you look, here we go again, but New York Times, Washington Post, they are now, they blocked everything. And now that Trump's been elected, now they're supporting Trump positions because they're, I'm not going to use the word, but they do what they're paid to do, I guess, in a way, or what's in their interest.
Are they doing what they're paid to do, or are they afraid?
No, I think they are part of the power structure. The mainstream media, and guess this is a subject of a 30-credit university program to discuss the prostitution of mainstream media, all right? And the directions from above by the management, et cetera, and there's so much discussion of how bad mainstream media is now, BBC, CBC, US, MSM, it's just awful. So anyway, I'm not going to get into that in detail, but by the way, I'm not an expert on media. You know.
By the way, I just want to clear things up. John Philpot really wanted to do the interview in French, and I insisted on doing it in English. So it's not his fault, it's my fault. I really wanted to talk about Syria because it's an international event, and I thought it was relevant to talk about it in Syria because we're going to reach a wider audience. And get back to what you mentioned in the interview, when did you try to write in Le Devoir? Did you actually try to?
I've tried to get articles in Le Devoir, as has my brother, as has Samir Saul, who's a very, professor of
Université de Montréal.
Yeah, yes. And there's been a resistance, a lot of discussion of the war.
When was that, by the way?
Ukraine. A lot of it's been on the Ukraine war, and putting into question some of the common thinking about Ukraine and then why Russia did what they did in relation to security, and they're getting refused and they're not being allowed to be published. And I've tried on several issues. I even tried with respect to BDS about 3 years ago, and it wasn't published. Sometimes things can squeak in, but Le Devoir has got, it's the mainstream media. I read it pretty regularly. I've had it for 40 years, but
So you're a big fan.
well, no, we like the Devoir, but so.
By the way, you always mentioned that you like Le Devoir, and then you spoke about media or media prostitution. That's the term you used. So, if there is such a control on media, what set Le Devoir apart from other media outlets?
It's come from the history of the Quebec National Movement, and they published a lot with respect to Quebec independence and the Quebec National Movement, and it came from Henri Bourassa, and it came from way back. And even now on Quebec issues, they do say things, and there are things about Quebec issues which come out, and it has a bit of a nationalist point of view, but on international affairs, it's not very positive. And I remember 20 years ago, Brian Miles, there were some issues at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and Brian Miles wasn't director, he was legal or judicial reporter or something, and I wrote him a letter to the editor, and he didn't publish it, and I don't even remember the facts of the case now, but it was obviously a question of injustice, and he didn't want to hear about it.
So I did a lot of research for this interview because I really wanted to dig into Syria. I wanted to start with the history, then talk about the Ba'ath Party with Hafiz al-Assad, then go to Bashar al-Assad, to the civil war, or as you call it, the Syrian War. And then I wanted to talk about December 8th and its global implications. However, I mean, when I spoke to you in the end of December, a lot of global events happened, and I wanted to discuss them more in not necessarily a structured way. I want to discuss them more like an open question. According to Monsieur Jean Philpot, what happened in Syria and why did it happen?
Well, let's go back a bit. First, the borders of Syria were created when the British Empire took over from the Turkish, from the Ottoman Empire, and they created borders in the Sykes-Picot, and then another agreement followed out, Paulet-Newson agreements, which defined the borders. And then we had the Second World War when the Soviet Union beat the Nazis, and it was a earth-shattering war, which led, for many reasons, to the decolonization movement of Africa, of Asia, all right? And the independence of Syria and the development of Syria beginning in 1946 was an important part of what we call Western Asia, the Middle East, but the Middle East is a British term, so let's call it Western Asia.
Seriously? The Middle East is a Western term?
It's the British term, because the Far East is Hong Kong, China. The Middle East is the middle, and then Britain is the master, all right?
Wow.
Whereas Western Asia is maybe Asian-centered, and you're looking at the West. So that's the discussion. That's actually debated, all right? So I like the term Western Asia. Now, so Syria was created, and it was not based on any ethnic group. It was based on borders, and Syria is composed of many types of groups, religions, languages, but that is Syria. And Mr. Bashar al-Assad, the father, and the son were the leaders of a country. And now people talk about, oh, well, the borders are artificial. They should have have these different groups have their autonomy. Kurds autonomy. So
Druze autonomy.
Druze autonomy. Now,
Alawites.
I'm not going to, I don't understand and master all the different groups in Syria. But one thing I can say is that changing borders at the behest of the wealthy powers, because the U.S. is still the master of the world, less so a bit, but still the master of the world, and they're still occupying the east of Syria, and the oil and the breadbasket of Syria are occupied by the U.S. So breaking up Syria into pieces is not a positive thing, and we'll get into the result now. It looks to me that Syria is in big trouble. The occupation of the Golan Heights after the 1973 war.
1967 war.
Yeah, 67 war, excuse me, yeah, you're right. Absolutely right. Is a continuing violation of Syrian sovereignty. People seem to have forgotten about it, but the people in the Golan consider themselves Syrian, as I understand.
They still do.
Yeah, they do. So it's not based on your religion. It's based on your membership in a country. So, and there's many other issues which I'm older than you are, so I remember hearing about Syrian occupation of Lebanon. And I think that started in 76. Someone can correct me on the date.
76.
Yes. Now, and people thought, oh, it's so horrible. But I think this Syria, remember, was an ally of the Soviet Union. It was intended to be socialist. And in many ways, it has aspects of socialism which we can talk about. Up until recently, there's aspects of it being socialist. And
like free education, free healthcare.
Women's rights. Yeah.
Women's rights.
Yeah. Progressive, very progressive country on many, many questions based on the principles of, well, you can call it socialism or equality for all, medical rights, human rights, food. These are all things which are the underlying part of Syrian existence since, well, it started in 1946. Under Bashar al-Assad, it became stronger. And there's also a big problem in the area called Zionism, called Israel, which its occupation based on the British imperial mandate of 1917 is a colonial occupation of Western Asia. And I understand that the Syrian presence in Lebanon was based also to oppose Israel, and because Syria has always stood up for Palestine. It's the only Arab state, as of a month ago, which stood up for Palestine. You can say, well, good or bad, medium. Really, was it really standing up for Palestine? Well, it stood up for Palestine, and it was part of the axis of resistance.
I mean, you could include different countries, like Algeria, for example.
Okay, not on the borders, though. You're right. And by the way, of course, Yemen is standing up for Palestine now. For sure. All right, but of those countries,
no, I'm talking outside of the axis of resistance, for example.
Yeah, but if you look at Syria, if you look at Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, Egypt, they're the major countries, and they aren't. They're either flirting with Israel, they're supporting Israel, but they're not supporting Palestine, and they haven't done much to support Palestine, and they haven't supported the right to take up arms, which is a right defined under the United Nations Charter. When there's an occupation, you're allowed, the occupied people have a right to take up arms.
You mentioned the Syrian occupation of Lebanon. I mean, initially speaking, though, Syria was invited at the behest of the Lebanese.
Yes.
I wouldn't say was it the Lebanese government, but I know it's not the National Front.
Well,
it's the Lebanese Front.
There's a civil war. There was a civil war going on.
There was a civil war
in Lebanon from
Lebanon
75
till 1990, and Syria was invited at the behest of the Lebanese Front, which was mainly the main families of the Maronites that were opposed. Of the basically the presence of the Palestinian refugees and the Palestinian resistance, which was the PLO back then, and there was this. That's one of the reasons for the civil war.
Sure.
And they asked the Syrians to come in to help them control those Palestinian resistance. So if one would push back on what you said, that they were there initially to actually oppose Zionism, but they actually went there to stop the Palestinian resistance. So how would you answer for that?
First, I know it's a live debate. I'm not an expert on the internal policies of Lebanon, so if I speak as if I know, that would be presumptuous. My understanding of this was to stabilize the situation and not necessarily to put down the Palestinians, but to stabilize the situation, because the Lebanese civil war was very, very difficult. And that happened when they were expelled from Jordan. Was it Black September?
Black September.
Yeah. And
that's 1970,
I was a student. I was living in Europe, and we were supporting Palestine. I didn't understand very much, but we were supposed to go there, and then Black September happened. We didn't go there. All right, and so that led to the. But anyway, your listeners can accept my admission that I'm not an expert on
it's
Lebanese
interesting
politics.
that you raised it that way, because it makes sense, because at the end of the day, it's not the Syrian forces that kicked out the PLO, it's the Israeli forces that kicked them out in 1982.
Yes, but then Hezbollah was born.
Yes, that's true.
And that was Sabra Shatila. And I don't know whether I told you, I was the judge at the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal.
Seriously?
In 2013, where we had a week-long hearing about Sabra Shatila, and we issued a judgment condemning Israel for the massacre, the 3 day. How many days did it last? 4 days?
3 to 4 days, yeah.
Massacre in September 13th.
Palestinian
of the Palestinians
in Sabra and Shatila.
Sabra Shatila. And I must stress that it was a court of opinion. It wasn't a legal court, but it proceeded with rigor. And the Israel was sitting on the heights nearby there. I've never been there, but sitting up there overlooking it, and the Lebanese forces were killing these people, but it was under super.
For our listeners, the Lebanese forces is not the army; it's a group in Lebanon.
For sure, absolutely.
Yeah, just to avoid the confusion.
I've forgotten the name.
Lebanese forces.
Yeah.
In Arabic, they're called
the extreme right. The extreme right wing pro-Israeli, anti-Palestinian.
Quwat al-Lebaniyya. Quwat al-Lebaniyya is basically what you're talking about, the group you're talking about. I mean, you're saying they're extreme right, but I mean, I think they represent maybe a good, at least 50% of the Christians in Lebanon.
Wow.
So, I mean, they have their own vision of what actually happened. Yes. And to be fair, I mean, the Palestinians that came from Jordan did not necessarily act fairly in Lebanon too, right?
I won't.
You won't enter.
I won't enter into that because I would be speaking
Yeah.
out of.
But for sure, I'm not going to defend Sabra and Shatila here. I'm just saying that, in my opinion, to cast 50% of the Lebanese Christians as extreme right is, obviously you're not trying to do that. I'm just saying
I'm not doing that, no.
you're not doing that. Is a bit too much, and their point of view would be Palestinians did a lot of mistakes during the Civil War. I'm not gonna debate this point with you for sure. Like you said, it's not your field of expertise. However, I'm just pointing out, to be fair, their point of view, but nothing excuses Sabra and Shatila.
No,
It was criminal, and it was disgusting. And I was reading Robert Fisk's book, Pity the Nation.
I have that book.
Pity the Nation, and there's a page or there's a chapter dedicated to it. And honestly, I was flabbergasted by how, and I'll use the word again, disgusting it was. And I suggest our listeners to read it, because it's mind-blowing how criminal a human being can be when he's given the opportunity to be a criminal.
That book is very good, by the way.
Yeah.
Pity the Nation. One of my friends gave it to me, I couldn't put it down.
Yeah, it's Robert Fisk. Even though towards the end of his life, I mean, he did change a bit his politics, especially regarding the Lebanese resistance.
I agree with you, but still.
But he did a very good job in writing that book. And he also, funny enough, spoke a lot about how he was labeled as an anti-Semitic, and how he was attacked as being one that not only criticizes Israel, but hates Israel because they're Jews, which is a tactic, sadly, that they're still using today.
And it's not going to go over that well, I hope, in the future.
Okay, so just to recenter the conversation about Syria,
Sure.
you were talking about Bashar al-Assad and Hafiz al-Assad took control of the country. They how can I say that? They went through the 1967-73 war. They were partly socialist, as you mentioned. They went into the civil war in Lebanon. We mentioned 1982 and the Israeli invasion, the birth of Hezbollah. Okay, what can you tell us more?
Well, we're Hezbollah was in Lebanon, wasn't in Syria.
Yeah.
It became involved in Syria
much later.
Around 2011, I think.
2011 was the civil war. Officially, I think they got involved in 2012, 2013, at the same time as the Iranians.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I view Syria as a progressive country, a sovereign country, which should be sovereign, which stood up for Palestine on the borders of Israel until December 8th? Was that
December 8th, yeah.
All right. And so its defeat is a setback. We both mentioned a few minutes ago the fact that Syria had free education, women's rights were respected. It was not sectarian in terms of religion. I'm not criticizing countries which have religious beliefs, but they had a philosophy of cooperation and non-sectarian attitude towards religion, of extreme tolerance with Christians, Sunni, Shia, Alawite. That's my understanding of it. So this was a very positive country, which was well developed economically. And if you look at Pepe Escobar right now, he I think I see him on Telegram. Yeah, he has pictures of Syria 20 years ago. Whereas Syria now, because Syria was very respectful, as I understand, of its historical heritage, and now the people in power now are not respectful, and in fact had destroyed and burned and destroyed colonial artifacts and colonial pre-colonial buildings. So
We'll get to December 8th and who's in power now. I just want to continue. Hafiz al-Assad passes away, and his son...
He died in 2000, didn't he?
2000, in June 2000.
Yeah.
He passes away. President Bashar al-Assad becomes the president of Syria. I'm going to talk geopolitically first. Two main events happened early in his presidency. 9/11.
Yes.
The Iraqi invasion and the Afghanistan invasion.
Yes.
And I wrote this because it's very relevant. General Wesley Clark, a U.S. Army general, tells a story about being told about a classified memo outlining to take out 7 countries.
Oh, yes.
In 5 years after 9/11. These countries were Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. How did these events shape and influence his presidency?
Well, there's a lot of discussion with the American leaders, and they tried to be friends and they tried to get along, all right? The Americans genuinely wanted to destroy Syria because Syria was a sovereign country in their way. And there's all the issue of Qatar and the gas pipeline, which was a way of taking gas from Qatar to Europe overland, all right, which is one of the reasons I understand Syria had said no to this, all right? That's one aspect of the attack on Syria. The other reason that they would like to overthrow Syria is that Syria was against Israel and Zionism. And we should always never forget Israel is not the devil. The devil or the boss is the U.S. Israel is an American outpost.
It's a proxy.
Proxy. And it's not the tail that wags the dog. It's the dog that wags the tail. All right? So Syria was a barrier to the American domination of Western Asia. And so this is one of the reasons they wanted to destroy Syria. They destroyed Iraq. Iraq is, how many years later? 23 years later, it's coming back in some way, maybe. Another issue, I don't fully understand Iraqi politics. I know there's a very strong resistance, the PMU, but so the opposition to Syria, the desire to destroy Syria has existed for at least 22 years, if not longer, all right? And if you want, we can get into 2011, but...
We'll get there. I just wanted to know your opinion. I mean, it's funny that, 2011 happened and you call it a Syrian war, and we're talking about I think this was in 2001, and that general already knew that Syria was on the list.
Yes.
So I find it a funny coincidence that on that list, and for Lebanon, for example, there was the 2006 war waged by Israel, Libya, Gaddafi.
Were they lost?
Yeah, Israel lost for sure, 100%.
2006.
Libya, Gaddafi's gone during the Arab Spring. Sudan, it's fractured, and there is a civil war almost happening now. Iran is constantly under attack. And I find it interesting that all those, Sudan was a very pro-resistance, from what I know.
Mm-hmm.
So all those countries share one thing, that they were very pro-resistance and they were against Zionism. So I find it weird and interesting that they were listed after 9/11. Why were they listed after 9/11, according to you?
Well, 9/11. Well, we're going to get into the whole question of whether 9/11 was a plot or not, and there's a lot of debate about it being fake.
What do you think?
I'm not going to make an opinion.
No,
I'm looking at the results. I look at the results of it.
Okay.
9/11 was allowed the U.S. to militarize the world, to attack Iraq, and it was a pretext for U.S. expansionism in the region. It's not impossible that it was a pure provocation engineered within the U.S. The story, I remember 9/11 very well. You probably don't. You were pretty young, but I remember 9/11 very well. We were all scared. I mean, what's going on? I mean, even though we mistrusted them, even at that time we mistrusted them. We saw them, these buildings falling down, but apparently some of it was fake. And it couldn't have happened. Probably couldn't have been knocked all those buildings down at the same time. They must have had explosion. They must have had dynamite in them.
Are you suggesting that Al-Qaeda didn't do it?
Who is Al-Qaeda? Okay, because remember, the history of Muslim extremism was invented by Brzezinski in the late 70s for Carter. The way to destroy and oppose Soviet socialism and the Soviet Union in Central Asia was to introduce Muslim extremism, and that's where Al-Qaeda came from. And if you look at pictures of Afghanistan in the late 70s, you see all these students, I see pictures of it, students as if they're almost in Western universities, dressed Western style, studying. Afghanistan was trying to be socialist, trying to develop with the Soviet Union, and like 40 years later, it's now very Muslim and very protected and very conservative. I'm not criticizing Islam when I say that, but they used Islam to break the Soviet Union, and the war in Afghanistan was very expensive for the Soviet Union, and it's one of the factors which made the Soviet Union weaker. If you get into the causes of why the Soviet Union collapsed, my God, that's another subject, and I'm not an expert on that either. I mean, I have my opinions like you do probably, but the extremist movement, it's not Islam, it's Western proxies acting to destabilize, and that's when you talk about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda came from that direction, and were they the ones in the U.S. who did it, or did the U.S. do it to itself, or was there an internal faction doing it? I don't know, and I don't think many people know, really. I mean, some people inside the States, I'm sure, know what happened, but us simple people from the outside, we don't know. Yeah, Michel Chossudovsky has his theories. I don't know that you read.
What does he say?
Well, he thinks it's a total conspiracy, but I don't.
Conspiracy, like there were no planes actually going into the building?
Well, I don't know. You see, this is a debate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole debate about truth about 9/11. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's books written about that, and I've read some things. I don't know what the answer is, though. But the U.S. has. I mean, John F. Kennedy was murdered.
Yeah.
He was murdered by his own people. Mm-hmm. Because he was trying to make peace with the Soviet. I'm convinced of that. Mm-hmm. All right, like he was murdered because he was trying to. Like I said, they can do their thing, we can do their thing, we can do our thing. He has a famous speech. Was it June '63? I could be wrong on the date now. I'm just.
No, it's fine.
But where he was speaking in terms of cooling down the Cold War. Basically. So. Yeah. So the U.S.
But I mean, if you compare that to actually two planes going into Twin Towers, that seems a bit far-fetched. I don't know.
Well, I'm not going to. You know what? I don't want to be branded
No, no,
in my mind, I don't like people to think that John Philpot is convinced of this and that because I don't know.
You're pointing out that there is different theories to what happened.
And it could have happened. It could have been planes going into them, but maybe simultaneously with being bombed. There could have been. It probably must have happened in part. Of course, but doesn't mean that's why the buildings fell.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Now to get back to Syria. So 9/11 happened. There was this plan to invade the Middle East, at least Iraq officially. And they did. They succeeded to remove Saddam Hussein. And they took control of Iraq. There was obviously resistance that came after a couple of years. But Bashar was still in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And you sent me an article, I think it's called Evaluating Bashar al-Assad Human Right Record. And you said you agreed mostly.
Well, Justin Potter is a professor from Toronto who, I think it's called the Anti-Imperialist Project. And he's very learned and very well-informed, Justin Potter. And he compared... well, I'll tell you a story, but he compared the prisons in Syria with the prisons in the U.S.
and Saudi Arabia.
And the percentage, Saudi was double the number of prisoners. The U.S. is 10 or 20 times as more than.
Yeah, I've got the numbers here. The prison population per 100,000 people was 68 in Syria compared to 131 in Saudi Arabia and 683 in the U.S.
A factor of 10.
Yeah, factor of 10 in the U.S.
So anyway, I'll tell you.
That's pre-Civil War. Right?
My professional experience, I was a defense lawyer at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And the opposing lawyer was a man my age named Stephen Rapp. And Stephen Rapp said that the Rwandan case is the worst genocide, and he invented all kinds of things, and I dealt with him on a daily basis as a lawyer, and we won the case, that the genocide, the particular case of the brother-in-law of the president, didn't do what Stephen Rapp was saying it was doing. And he was a senior American official who became Obama's wartime genocide advisor, okay?
In Syria?
Around the world, okay? He became his advisor around 2013, I think, all right? Stephen Rapp, U.S. Representative for War Crimes and Genocide, all right? So 2 weeks ago, one of my friends said, John, Stephen Rapp's in Syria now. And he said it's the worst genocide he's ever seen, the worst crimes he's ever seen. And I just said to my God, what's this guy? I used a word to my friend, which I can't say in public. But it started with B and ended with S, So anyway, the thing about it is that the U.S., the concept of using human rights to justify anything is very often very dishonest. We all believe in human rights. You and I, everybody here, don't want people to be killed. We don't want people to be in prison. We do not want to be people in prison for no reason. All right? We have people in prison in Canada because they killed somebody, because they're in organized crime, because they're trafficking in drugs. All right? So they, unfortunately, they have to be in prison. All right? I don't like it. I'm a defense lawyer. But when Stephen Rapp goes on about Syria, and we know that it's not exactly true, in the sense that people in Syria, people were thrown in jail, especially after 2011, because they were taking up arms against a legitimate government on behalf, in my opinion, of a foreign power. Hillary Clinton admitted it, that they were supporting the jihadists and these terrorist criminals, who, by the way, have power now, but that's another question. They were supported by Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
Okay, I will jump into the Syrian War fairly soon. We're just going to continue the article because it's dividing Syria. It's well divided in the sense where it's talking about Syria pre-civil war and after the war. So it talked about like you said, the prisons, the elections. It mentioned something about while Saudi Arabia doesn't have elections, the U.S. largely functions as a two-party system. Syria held elections, albeit controversial. So they were trying to make this argument and about the fact that there's no actual democracy in the U.S. because it's only two parties and they
call
have
it uniparty.
They called it the uniparty and they have the same policies. I mean, don't you find it like if you ask anybody on the streets, they wouldn't say there's no elections in the U.S. Would you agree?
Well, that's another interesting discussion right now because historically, particularly before Trump, the Bush family and the Democrats were almost inseparable, and I don't want to get into the full debate about Trump because I don't think the uniparty model applies exactly at present in the U.S. because there's a new direction coming out where they didn't want Trump. They charged him with all kinds of, they distorted the judicial system to get after him. There was 2 assassination attempts. All the media were against him. And Trump said some things which were true. And he said the wars destroy our country. And we need to get back to our American values. And I listened to his speech last night, and obviously I disagree with large parts of it. However, the uniparty model of the states doesn't stand up completely right now.
Okay. And they also discussed the child mortality rates in Syria that were lower than in most neighboring countries.
For sure.
Okay, so if I can push back a bit on the article. They ask how badly did Bashar al-Assad violate human rights during this period. I mean, I find it interesting that you mentioned prisons. However, there's missing metrics. I mean, if you use the U.S. as a comparison, there's freedom of speech. There's no corruption. There's
no corruption.
I'm sorry. There's, I would say, would you agree that there's less corruption in the U.S. than there was in Syria?
No, the U.S. is all money. It's all based on what you buy and the power you get. And Silicon Valley and the mainstream media are all controlled by money. And by the way, free speech in the U.S. I can stand on a street corner. I can I can organize a political party and sell left-wing newspapers in the street. I can't access the main media. All right. So in U.S., the free speech is controlled by the big multimedia companies, and you can't express yourself in the U.S. So I don't believe that there's free speech.
But you're not going to be put in prison just because you insult the president.
No, but you have very little fundamental debate about the direction of your country.
No, we agree. I mean, we mentioned it at first that your letters weren't put out into the wall, and that's fair. However, there's a discrepancy there between a police state and something we call the democratic state in the U.S., where people, I feel, maybe Syrians didn't, and maybe that's why the prison numbers were so low in Syria, because not necessarily people were happy, but they were afraid. Is that a fair
it's a state
criticism?
Of war. It's a state of war.
No, I'm not talking about 2011. I'm talking about pre-2011.
Well, even then, there's been a lot of contestation, and there's the role of the Muslim Brotherhood and all the conflicts in Syria where people criticize the Assad governments, the pre-and governments, for throwing people in prison. But the Muslim Brotherhood at that time was controlled, as I understand, by the British. And they were trying to destabilize Syria. So when there's a destabilization attempt, this is my reading of it, I wasn't there. Again, I repeat, I'm not an expert. That is the reason, one of the reasons why there is repression all right?
So you agree there's repression?
Repression is not always wrong.
Ah, why not?
Sometimes it's necessary.
Okay.
Because it's a hotly contested region, the Western Asia, and the British never give up.
Can you give me an example when it's actually justified?
Repression?
Yeah.
It's normal. When in a state of war, in state of war or near war, and you have opposition who want to take up arms, well, they have to go to prison.
But if the repression goes beyond simply telling people not to say certain things because it's not the time to say them, and there's extrajudicial killing, for example, would you say that that's unacceptable, regardless of the situation?
Extrajudicial killing is wrong. Of course, it's wrong.
Okay,
and that's what happens. And that's what happens all over in Latin America when they had extrajudicial killings. Look at what's happening in Palestine. It's all extrajudicial killings. I don't think there's extrajudicial killings in Iran right now.
No, I didn't mention Iran.
But the point is, extrajudicial killings are wrong. Clearly, they're wrong.
Okay. So when people say that there's repression in Syria and there's no freedom of speech, they're saying that they're afraid to say something that's maybe. You're saying that Syria was a country that thought about themselves as Syrians first before thinking of themselves as Alawites or Sunnis or Shiis or Druze. And I agree, it's a lot better than Lebanon. But still, there's a fact here that for 50 years, Alawites were governing the country. Alawites are 10% of that country. Sunnis make up, I think, 70 and 80. I could be wrong. I'm doing like I could be wrong with the numbers. But I think, so you would think that that Sunni majority has a different approach to Syria. Their vision, not necessarily, maybe they had a vision similar to Turkey. You don't know. So if there is a state where there is extrajudicial killings and there's no freedom of speech, that would make the numbers lower. Would you agree that?
Of course, but the concept, the number of extrajudicial killings of a political nature, I don't think it was a major phenomenon in Syria. All right? And Syria, they had elections, they had internal debates on their policy, and they developed a progressive social and educational policy. And I don't think that this type of argument justifies the overthrow of the Syrian government. And if you move on to 2011, which is the logical result of this, there was protesting at that time. So you can protest here in Quebec, you can protest and you protest in the U.S. In the U.S., all the students supporting Palestine are locked out of the universities and some are expelled, professors are expelled. And so the pot can't call the kettle black, especially when we're in powerful West. But in 2011, in many countries...
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
What do you think most Syrians wanted in 2011?
Well,
what do you think initially when they came out to the streets, before the arms and everything? What do you think they wanted?
It was a special movement of, this new awakening in the Arab countries, which was basically Western oriented, Western financed and organized by NGOs in the West. And what happens is, you can be discontent. You can have, obviously it's not a fully developed country. It's a somewhat undeveloped country still at that time, and people were protesting. Probably legitimately, I'm sure. But why does it happen? When I'll give you an example. Here, when we talk here, people say, "Oh, wow, that's interesting what you're talking about," but they don't act. There's no. it's hard to find a way to act and speak up. So the protesting of 2011 was obviously legitimate. The Canadian embassy was involved in it, financing it.
Mm-hmm.
All right? So when protesting becomes a proxy movement,
Mm-hmm.
then that's when it gets dangerous. And the Western human rights movement, since when does the West believe in human rights? Since when does the U.S. and Canada believe in human rights when they finance and they send arms to Israel? It's a false debate,
Mm-hmm.
all right? And so the question about whether Syrian people had the right to of course they have a right to protest in their internal legislation, internal policies. But when it becomes a proxy force against the Syrian government, then the question of repression enters into it. And like I can remember, Michel Descoteaux was the former director of Le Devoir. 2012.
He passed away recently.
Yes, yeah, he did. Yeah, so I remember that very well. But I thought about him. I didn't know much about him, but he was in favor of bombarding Syria in 2012. Come on, bombarding Syria, and Syria had some chemical weapons. So what they said is, "Oh, take them. We don't want them. We don't need them." By the way, chemical weapons are not useful. They don't work. Apparently, that's what the military. It doesn't work. It kills your own people, and it doesn't work very well, and you don't win a war with it. Syria got rid of it. But so there's a lot of propaganda in 2011-12 against Syria, and we were all concerned about it. I mean, I don't know whether you remember that, but I remember that very well, thinking about it and trying to understand, as I'm an outsider, right? Trying to understand that. And luckily, I became to understand that it was a proxy war. All right?
Okay, so your argument is, well, let's divide it. The West didn't really care about the human rights, didn't care about the Syrians. They just wanted that government to fall because, I'm assuming, it's part of the axis of resistance, so it's against Zionism. Is that your argument?
I think there's a bit, well, it's
I'm
more
talking about the West.
It's more nuanced than that, but you're right. But also they wanted Syria to be weaker so that they could allow the gas pipeline. They wanted to have small, malleable countries and regions, a weak country, not a strong country. All right? Because the U.S. always likes small, weak countries. They want the Congo to be broken up. They wanted Yugoslavia to be broken up because Yugoslavia was resisting, and that's why they had the war in Yugoslavia in 1990. So it's multifaceted, and what is the real? There's no single reason, but they don't like to have strong countries in Western Asia because their plans are to control it. And as you pointed out very clearly, the plan of Wesley Clark was to overthrow those 5 countries because what the U.S. wants is all that oil. They want that geostrategic region under their control, and
they want puppet states, basically.
Yes, but there's also one more thing which people are writing about now, and there's a man called British geographer named Mackinder, who talked about who controls that part of Asia controls the world. Okay. What's the name of the book? But it's quoted quite frequently now, and I went to the library and looked at it and leafed through it. I didn't buy it. I didn't go through it completely, but Harold Mackinder, I think his name is, and your readers can tell me whether people listening can tell me whether, John, you're off the wall. But that's part of the world for which the strategic control is so important, and that takes us to Donbass, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Georgia, Armenia, Turkey, Syria. All that part of the world is so central to apparently the control of the entire world.
Is it central for its energy, its location? Why is it central?
Both. location. It's a strategic center of the geographical and power center because there's so much wealth. There's so much natural wealth, Russia, so much natural wealth in the Ukraine, so much wealth, natural resources in Saudi Arabia and Syria, in Afghanistan. So
I heard the theory it's central because they're trying to prevent China from connecting land to the Mediterranean Sea.
that's a part of it for sure. But this obsession, that this area is important, predates the Silk Road.
Silk
Okay,
Road, right?
but there's no doubt that that's part of it because China's economic interest on a sovereign equality basis, not on an imperialist basis, would like to be able to travel, have the connections through that area. All right.
We're going to get into more details about the Syrian war. However, at least you spoke about the geopolitics behind why Syria was attacked. However, I find that sometimes we neglect the importance of people inside of Syria. Like the person that says that I have the right to protest and take down the government if we want to. What's the difference between, for example, and that's an argument that they throw, between the Syrian revolution and the Iranian revolution that took out the Shah, for example? What would you respond to that?
What Syrian revolution?
The Syrian civil war to try to take out Bashar al-Assad.
Oh, that was
yeah,
okay. Well,
it's legitimate for a people that want.
Let me tell you, of course, the Iranian revolution in '79 was based.
I'm going to stop you there, just because I want to continue my argument so that you understand my question.
Yeah.
The Iranian revolution went from a very liberal, like the example you gave me about Afghanistan, a very liberal, westernized, closed West, to a very Islamic state. So what's the problem for Syrians to want exactly the same thing?
All right. First, that's not the right question to ask. All right?
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. overthrew Mossadegh in '53.
Mm-hmm.
Moderate, liberal-minded, small L liberal, not big L liberal, small L liberal Iranian politician who nationalized the oil industry, which was very important. And Bobby Kennedy in the U.S. overthrew him. It was a Western colonial overthrowing of a sovereign national government, and they put the Shah in there, who westernized the country and extreme inequality, all right? And no values, and only the rich were well off. So the Iranian Revolution, couched in religious terms, decided the population overthrew the Western-oriented government, took hostages from the U.S. Embassy. That is an internal revolution. It wasn't a foreign imposed revolution. It was an internal revolution. The Syrian war, and I mentioned you talked about some notes, and I'd look at my notes. Mm-hmm. Civil war. My notes say it's not a civil war. It's an international war. And that's fine. Because it's also called a civil war. But look at it. Was it really a civil war in terms of the political nature of the war? No, it was financed from outside by the U.S., by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar. They organized and threw Syria out of the Arab League. They killed how many people? I don't know. Large numbers of people. The jihadists. They desecrated national the culture of the country. They killed people blindly, took children out of their family, the young men out of their family's house and killed them. They killed people because of their religion, clearly. And it was a foreign-inspired terrorist. There's a lot of Chinese Uyghurs in there all right? People from the Dagestan and the Stans in the Central Asian countries who are terrorists who were paid for it, well paid, relatively well paid, not that well paid, but they were based in a lot of them were based in Turkey. I understand opposite Istanbul's on one side of the Straits of Marmara, and then there's a town on the other side, Üsküdar, I think its name. A lot of them were based in there. So this was an overthrow of a sovereign government. And what happened is that the war lasted from 2011 to 2018-19, where they had a kind of a cessez-le-feu, a ceasefire. Syria was occupied. Northern Syria was occupied by the jihadists. The Kurdistan was occupied, and the west of Eastern Syria, the breadbasket of Syria, was occupied by the U.S., who stole the oil. Donald Trump admitted it. We want that oil, and all the best wheat growing areas were under control. That was not a revolution. That is a conquest by proxies. There's no comparison with the Iranian Revolution. And that people want things, well, of course, I mean, people can want things, but you look at, you can't just say people want. Doesn't mean it has no scientific or political meaning, because what the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Qatar did is they used foreign fighters to overthrow. They got a ceasefire, and then they applied the Caesar sanctions. The money, Syrian money, was useless. Apparently, like army general.
2018 to 2024, yeah.
Yeah, and was an army general was making $40 a month or something like that, some figure like that.
Best case scenario, $40 a month, yeah.
Yeah, so that country was down, and we don't know how it's going to react and how it's going to. And they brought in the terrorist Jolani, who's on a terrorist list for good reason, I think. Although I don't agree with the U.S. terrorist designations, but they brought him in, put him in a suit, and made him. He's not elected. There's no concept. He said elections are going to take 4 years. Bashar al-Assad was elected. They had elections. I had friends who were observers in the elections. It was, Bashar al-Assad's wife was in China about 6 months ago speaking about Palestine, about why Palestine needed to be free. So you can't. It's not a revolution in Syria. It's a coup d'état, organized by the West, organized by Turkey and the U.S. And they put those people in power. Israel invaded more beyond the Golan. They bombed and destroyed the entire Syrian military, airplanes, army bases. All right? And how far are they? 25 kilometers from Damascus now?
They're not very far, yeah.
Yeah. And today, we read they're building a military base. I don't know whether you saw that. I saw that today or yesterday. That Israel's building a military base, and the new powers in Syria have really didn't protest at all. Now they're saying, I think they said a couple of days ago, well, we have to become sovereign, but Syria can't react. It would take them how many years before they can get. If and when they wanted to be sovereign again, how long would it take them to build up an army? Because they've had a serious army. So you can't compare Iran and Syria. They're total opposites.
My question was more based on the fact that when you have a nucleus of people, a big percentage of Syria that's not unhappy, like we mentioned, lack of freedom of speech, corruption, extrajudicial killing, you are providing a landscape to allow countries that you mentioned to be able to provide the money, the weapons, even the fighters to go into that country. It didn't fall just because a coup d'etat happened. It fell, and at least one opinion in the States, it fell because it was ready to actually fall.
Well, after 4 years of sanctions,
Mm-hmm.
after 4 years of intense sanctions, they had no money left. They had nothing left. The army couldn't fight, apparently. That's what
The army couldn't fight for sure. But however, I mean, if Russia, Iran, and other groups hadn't intervened the first 2 years, it would have fell too.
Okay, well, Russia intervened on the 29th of September 2015, militarily. And that was a legitimate intervention because Syrian government asked Russia to help them because they were being invaded by other countries, all right? Thank God. You know, when you have a foreign invasion, U.S., Saudi, Qatari invasion, with the tacit support of Israel, that Russia intervenes is totally legal and totally, in my opinion, very desirable and positive result, because we're talking about the introduction of the multipolar world, of the BRICS world, which is, the BRICS came later, but that was the that's why that happened, I think. And
because when you start an article and you say, how badly did Bashar al-Assad violate human rights during the civil war? I mean, some people would argue that question alone warrants change in Syria.
that question is, the article was written to counter the human rights argument that my former friend, enemy, Stephen Rapp, said the human rights in Syria is the worst I've ever seen. He said the same thing about Rwanda, of course, but about Rwanda, not under Kagame, but the previous government, which is not true. All right. So Justin Potter wrote that article, and that's tongue-in-cheek, okay?
Okay. So now the civil war lasted between 2011 and 2024. However, you said there was like a hiatus.
There was a ceasefire.
There was a ceasefire in
From
2018.
2018,
2018 to 2024, there were the Caesar sanctions. Things weren't getting better in Syria.
No.
And then eventually everything collapsed in December 8th.
Well, collapse is the wrong word.
What happened?
They invaded. They armed them. They were the original terrorists were not that well organized. But when they came down from Idlib, then they had modern arms. They were ready, and and the Syrian army was weak. People say they were bought off. It probably were. They probably just walked away. They got some money and walked away. I don't know for sure. But these terrorists who came down, this proxy army of Turkey and the U.S., came down, and they were very well armed. And it made me think of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, who invaded Rwanda beginning on October 1st, 1990. Well-armed, disciplined terrorist army, all right? And Syria could not stand up to these people.
But you have to agree that nobody actually fought, right?
Apparently,
So
they just backed off. Apparently,
I'm not just talking about the army. I mean, even the citizens. It's like they were discontent. They were not happy with the current situation.
in 2014? Oh,
Not
2020.
I'm talking about December 8th, 2020.
Yeah, well, under sanctions, why? They have nothing. They have no food. They have nothing.
So they did not want Bashar al-Assad.
No, it's not. No, they didn't. They didn't take up arms to fight. They couldn't fight these terrorists, these highly armed terrorists, heavily armed terrorists, and their army was doing nothing. You know, I mean, I read about this, and Iran and Russia had been prepared to help, but when the Syrian army folded, they couldn't stop it. All right? And we're not talking about the population. We're talking about a war between the terrorists and the Syrian army, and the Syrian army just wasn't there. You can't blame the civilians. Their army didn't act. And besides, the civilians have no arms, and they were like, I know some people who went to Syria last year.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently it was very difficult. Very, very difficult. Not as bad as Gaza, but they were having a very hard time.
Obviously, the sanctions didn't really help. Okay, so
it really hurt.
Yeah, it really hurt.
I'm a member of a group called Sanctions Kill.
Mm-hmm.
Sanctions kill, by the way. They destroy. They take away. We have some money. When we work, if you make, $300 a week, which is not very much, well, you can buy something with $300. It's not $40 a month, right?
Mm-hmm.
We make more than $300 a week. Most people, they make 600 or 800 or 1,000 a week, But so we're not under sanctions here in Canada.
So after what happened on December 8th, what does that mean for Syria and the whole region?
Well, there are different theories, and I've been listening, of course, to one of the wisest people on this, Sharmin Nerwani, and the Cradle, and I've been trying to understand it. I think with this Syrian invasion, coup d'etat, not a revolution, it's weakened the axis of resistance and strengthens the hands of the U.S. imperialism quite significantly. They've also weakened the resistance in Lebanon. Hezbollah is weaker now. They've destroyed Gaza. Iran is scared right now. I think they're very nervous about what can happen to them. The Iraqi resistance is not that strong. Yemeni is still strong, but so I think we're in a situation where the people in the region are weaker probably now than they were before, all right? And that the U.S. imperialism is stronger and came out of this on top for now, all right? And when I say for now, it doesn't mean the resistance is going to be strong in 6 months. It could take longer, and the alternate point of view is that the resistance in Palestine can be said to have won the war because Israel didn't get any of its objectives of destruction, eliminating Hamas, destroying Palestinian resistance overall, expelling people from the West Bank. So I think it's a big setback right now. Syria was the country which blocked Israeli expansionism. Israel wants to expand. They're already expanding into Lebanon, into Syria. We'll see how long it goes. So I think we're in a situation of setback. All right.
You seem to criticize Al-Julani, whose name is Ahmad al-Shara, a lot.
Yes, I know the two names. But I don't know the second name. I can't pronounce.
Shara.
Well, he's a terrorist. He's just. He's just a wanton terrorist who's dressed up to be woke, and he's dressed up to be polite. Now he doesn't carry his Kalashnikov. All right.
Mm-hmm.
He's a terrorist and a gangster. All right.
What do you think he's doing in Syria? What do you think what's his role?
He's trying to build a government.
Okay.
He's trying to control it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand. Syria is cut up into pieces now, mm-hmm. and I don't know if it can be unified. I just really can't evaluate that. Mm-hmm. What's striking is that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, who actually I know, but doesn't matter whether I know, he doesn't care about me. He went there and met Mr. Jolani and the other name I can't pronounce.
Shara.
Shahad, to talk about the International Criminal Court investigating crimes committed in the 13-year civil war. He calls it a civil war. It's not exactly the best expression, but so it's like if the chief prosecutor here in Quebec goes and meets the Hells Angels and said, we'd like to investigate crimes committed by the Hells Angels. Would you, as leader of the Hells Angels, help us? Mm-hmm. Come on, it's a farce. It's a total farce. And I have a lot of friends who are, I would consider them, I represent some people and I really like them. And they say, and I said, Syria is a big setback. And they said, well, how can you support someone who killed all our people? And I said, well, we went back to the debate. We're talking about human rights in Syria and whether or not it's a proper debate, whether or not Syria was so bad. There's lots of Palestinian camps who support Palestine in Syria. So, like, it's a big mistake. Syria is a setback, and demonizing Syria is a major error and a lack of understanding. And where can people go from here? And I certainly don't have that answer. And I'm Canadian. I'm a Quebecois lawyer, you know, but it's not that good right now, I don't think. And
let's continue on Ahmed Shara. I'm going to repeat it until you're able to say his name. Ahmed Shara seems calculated when he does his press conferences. It's as if he's acting like a president.
Yeah, he's being coached by Western public relations guys. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. He's not. I mean, they have Western public relations guys telling him how to do it. He's dressing up like a Westerner now. Like I am. I'm a lawyer.
So you're implying that Syria will become or is a puppet state?
Yes. Well, who went there? The German foreign minister.
The French.
The French went there. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't go to see Bashar al-Assad, who was resisting them. She went there. She comes from a Nazi background. Her family comes from a Nazi background. She's green, but she's all into the war in supporting Zelensky. Okay. So they're trying to make Syria into a puppet Western state. And
is it going to be one state or many states?
How do I know? Do you know?
I'm asking a question. I don't know.
No, I don't know. It's already broken up. All right, Israel's occupying the south. The east is occupied by the U.S. The whole Kurdish question is still totally present, and how it can be resolved. It's wrong to break up Syria based on Kurdish membership. I already represented people from Kurdistan in the past, a long time ago, because they did have a hard time in Turkey. But
could you find it in yourself, like, to see some positive light of what's happening in Syria right now? That maybe Ahmed Shara is not the terrorist that you think, that he actually wants the betterment of his country?
No, I don't believe that. I think he's working for the U.S. and Turkey. We'll see what Turkey does, because Turkey is not totally in the hands of the U.S.
It brings, you mentioned a great point, Turkey. Do you think it's in the interest of Turkey for Syria to be a puppet state of the states?
Well, that's the thing which we don't know about, and we don't know, okay? And whether or not he wants what I've read is that he wants to exert influence, especially in northern Syria, for Turkish business and Turkish, neo-Ottoman interests. All right.
Well, he has also two main issues, right? The Kurdish issue,
Yes.
and the Syrian refugees, which are like
For
4
sure.
million in Turkey. So you can look at it as it's his interest for there to be a stable Syria for them to be able to return, right?
Aren't they starting to expel them?
I'm not sure.
They're supposed to be expelling them, but he wants to get rid of the Syrian refugees who fled because of his war and the West's war on Syria. That they fled, but I understand that he wants also to incorporate indirectly or directly large parts of northern Syria into Turkey. All right, and whether Syria will survive as a country, that's for me, it would be presumptuous to make a prediction.
Okay.
With the Israeli occupation, a new military base in the south, no Syrian army left. A country cannot exert its sovereignty if it doesn't have an army.
Last question on Syria. Do you think Bashar al-Assad could have handled this any better?
Well, the sanctions shouldn't have happened. After the sanctions, it made it harder. Some people say that Bashar al-Assad was not following the advice of Iran and Russia to negotiate with Erdogan. All right. Some say that Bashar al-Assad was soft on America and trying to endear himself to Saudi Arabia over the last year. And therefore he had his guard down. Some say that Iran had warned him 4 or 5 months ago of the imminent invasion from Idlib. These are all hypotheses, all right, which may indicate possible errors in his resistance. It's hard for me to make a if. I don't know whether I can answer it. The sanctions were very difficult. The West, it was the U.S. and Israel who, the ceasefire in Lebanon was the 27th of November.
The 27th of November. Exactly.
And
a couple of days later, yeah.
They invaded. So wasn't there a direct connection? It seems like there has to have been a direct connection.
Yeah, a lot of people mentioned that coincidence. Yeah. I asked that question because I wanted to know, you gave your opinion regarding external policies. I mean, internally, if you compare, for example, and I mentioned corruption a lot, because if you compare, for example, Fidel Castro's Cuba and corruption, and Syria's Bashar al-Assad and corruption. I mean, there were a lot of sanctions on Fidel Castro, but people did not give up on him the same way they gave up on Syria.
They were, Fidel Castro was very severe about corruption.
Okay.
And they, what year? Let's say 92, but I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. There was a Cuban general who was involved in drug trafficking. He got the death penalty.
So that's what I meant by, were there any internal policies that Bashar could have done better?
Well, I mentioned some of them in my last sentence or two, and the sanctions were devastating. One thing also is important in comparison, when you compare. Cuba had a revolution with a leader who maintained the revolutionary policy until his death on November 25th, 2016. I was there when he died by chance in Cuba at a conference. And the new government is following in his footsteps with clear revolutionary principles. Bashar al-Assad has been forced with the human rights and democratic movement to not be a socialist revolutionary. Maybe he never was, I don't know. Maybe his family never was, I don't know. So he was on the defensive, maybe, and he didn't have the same political force that Castro had. But again, comparing apples and oranges is difficult, and I'll leave it up to your listeners to debate and resolve some of these things we're talking about, which are very important.
Okay. I have a couple more questions, but
Yeah,
they're
go ahead.
different than the Syria question. You mentioned the inauguration of President Trump yesterday. How will his term shape the region and the world?
Oh my God. How many editorials are being written today in newspapers, and how many webinars are debating that question? And what do I think versus what my close friends don't think like I do? And what I heard today when he put an end to the Biden had made sanctions against some Israeli settlers, and he lifted those. He lifted those today.
Yeah.
Okay, by decree today.
Wow.
But on the other hand, he forced Netanyahu
To accept the ceasefire.
to accept the ceasefire. And to me, the most very important thing will be if he can settle the war in Ukraine. Because what Russia wants and will get is no Nazification of Ukraine, no NATO on its borders, and hopefully, and that's what they will get. There's no doubt about it. In my opinion, they're winning totally. Whether or not Trump can negotiate a new security agreement with Russia, because that is central to the future of the next 5, 10, 20 years in the region. If Trump can manage that, there are some indications. I don't know whether you listen to the Duran, but that the U.S. is beginning to understand it's not a ceasefire that Russia wants. They want a resolution of this war. They don't want to have a ceasefire which then will start up again. A ceasefire in Gaza, a ceasefire in Korea, the armistice, okay. They don't want that. They want to make sure there's no more NATO, and they want to have agreements on that. Is Trump understanding it? Is his entourage understanding that dynamic? Some say yes, some say no. All right?
I think Russia is getting even a part of Ukraine, right?
Well,
The Donbass,
it's always been part of Ukraine.
No, I know. You mean Russia?
Yeah, Russia. Yeah.
It's part of Russia.
Russia's got 4 provinces which voted overwhelmingly to join Russia. They've been discriminated against since 2014. They've been bombed. They've had their language forbidden. You know, they've had their schools. They can't speak their language in public. Okay, and so it could be more than that. Who knows? Okay, that war has to be resolved. Okay, that war was a war of, in my opinion, of defense. And they don't commit crimes like Gaza. People still, if you look at Kiev, people driving their cars around, they're doing things. They don't bomb civilians. I mean, there have been some people killed, of course, but not wanton destruction of civilians and civilian infrastructure.
I don't know if you noticed, but I mean, you spoke about Trump in a bit of a positive light.
Yes.
So what's his philosophy or political
Well, that's
philosophy?
do I know that? Like, I sort of think about it, and then I'm proven wrong in part. I mean, obviously, his taking over the Panama Canal is wrong, because Carter gave it back. Well, they fought and got it back, and Carter gave it back. Taking of Greenland, trying to make Canada 51st state, that's totally wrong. I'd be very frightened for Latin America, for changing the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Come on, that's obviously wrong. But can he negotiate the lowering of the United States as a unilateral one single power, and recognize that there are different spheres of interest? That would be a step forward, you know. And that's why I'm saying, because Russia does not want to be colonized or recolonized. Okay? Can he respect China? And those are very hot issues. And remember that the U.S. has tried to dominate the world, one could say from 1803, from the Monroe Doctrine. Then they took the 1898. They took they took Cuba, Philippines. They fought Haiti. So all the wars after the Cold War. Can the U.S. change, and will it change? It doesn't really look that hopeful, but maybe they'll have no choice. All right, because, I mean, the settlement in Gaza is not because the U.S. gave that. No. People in Gaza and the West Bank, they fought. And the U.S. suddenly realized maybe this can't go on, I mean, what went through in their minds, except that they did stop it, okay? And the prisoners are going back, okay?
It's interesting that you took it from that angle. I mean, from how I saw it, was they just wanted to calm everything down. They wanted a ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon. They want to potentially talk to Iran about a nuclear deal. They want to end the war in Russia and Ukraine, and then just focus solely on China. Or am I wrong?
But focusing, you're right. You may be right completely. And are they going to go all out on China, or are they going to try and get along? I don't know. Okay, but the first part of those things is pretty much what I'm saying. Okay, in different terms maybe, but that's sort of the. To me, like I know how I feel about this. Like, I'm not talking about as a so-called as a lawyer. I'm saying, phew, phew. It's not going to be nuclear war in the next 6 months or a year.
Okay.
That's how I see it.
Okay. You mentioned annexing Canada. Could it reignite the conversation about Quebec nationalism?
Well, that's an interesting point, because what happens is that Canada has its interests, and Quebec has its interests, and Quebec has to fight back on its own and not depend on English Canada to avoid any taking of control or occupation. And you will note that the French-speaking population of the U.S. don't speak French anymore. Louisiana is a bit. The ones in Vermont, it's finished French, okay? So Quebec has to resist overwhelmingly any attempt to recolonize or to colonize Canada or Quebec by the USA. And it has to have its own approach to this, and not depend on English Canada, who couldn't give a damn about Quebec and don't understand Quebec at all. And by the way, Alberta doesn't want to fight.
What does that mean?
They don't want to have an oil embargo.
So they want to accept the tariffs. That's what you mean.
That's what it seems to be. I mean, that's what this is very dynamic. Like the tariffs are coming in 2 weeks, aren't they? Not apparently.
So why do you care so much about Quebec, by the way?
I live in Quebec, and I'm Quebec. I'm adopted in Quebec. Have you been living in Ontario? This is my home here now. And by the way, whether it's my home or not, it's a home of the French-speaking people of Canada, of North America, and it's got its own culture and its own economic interest. It's a nation which has to have its self-determination guaranteed, probably to become a country. All right?
Are you hopeful one day that that's going to happen?
I have no idea about that. I can't decide. But
would you want to?
I would like it to become a country, of course.
On that note, I think we're good. Thank you for coming,
Thank you.
Mr. Jean Philpot.
Thank you.
Have a good day.